Hi, everybody. My name is Yehuda or Judah Melamed, and I'm starting this YouTube video series called Thoughts on the Hebrew Bible, TOTHB. We'll see how long that acronym lasts, but for now, that's the acronym. And I will be sharing my thoughts with you about the Hebrew Bible. I'm starting this series because I do work in the field sporadically in academic Bible, and it takes a long time often to get ideas written and published, etc. And I do think that I have some ideas that I want to share with people so that they can learn it for themselves, but also use any insights if they find it insightful that I provide to help develop more insights. So this really is because I feel like sharing things that have been in my brain and are in my brain, and I've been meaning to publish them, and hopefully one day I will, but I just haven't had the time to write them out in publishable form. But I know that I gain a lot from podcasts and YouTube videos that other people make of disciplines and literature that I'm interested in. So I would like to contribute my part and help people if I can who are interested to see things in the Bible that I think are worth seeing. So what I provided here just on screen is a little bit of an outline. Hopefully, if I figure it out, at the bottom of this video, there should be links to the next things that I'm going to go through, which are some principles. As you can see, number 3 on the outline, the HB0A is just going to be my internal document number. So it's Hebrew Bible 0. Okay, don't worry about that. I'll explain that one day. So we're going to go over just 2 main principles behind this video series and some of the repercussions of those principles. And then I'm going to share a little bit of about the resources and references that are both available online and that you can find in a library, or if you feel like purchasing books or borrowing books from someone who has them, some resources that might be useful to both understand my videos specifically, but also in general, in order to understand the Hebrew Bible better as well. And then finally, just because I don't want this to be entirely about theory and principles, etc., I'm going to include one example of an insight that I believe is pretty good on Genesis 37:22 with regard to Jacob's son Reuben is going to rescue Joseph from his brothers. So that verse is an interesting verse that I want to take a look at. Okay, so let's get started with the principles. Okay, looking at the principles page. So first off, don't get too scared. It's kind of a warning. I'll read it out loud, the first principle on the top of the first page there. Although everyone is welcome to these videos, I designed it as an advanced course or video series on topics and passages in the Hebrew Bible. And all I mean by that is, as I say, some familiarity with different texts and topics may be advisable or necessary to fully understand the matters that I want to discuss. So again, don't get too scared. I will try to make everything as accessible and inclusive as possible, at least for English speakers. Those are my only 2 languages, Hebrew and English. So if you're counting on some other translation, I can't do it, but I will try to make everything accessible in English. I'm just pointing out that if you want to understand things to the fullest extent, there are several spheres of literature and history and archaeology, etc., that would be useful, especially in the videos that I make. I'm probably going to invoke the following 3 sources of information. So you can see those sources. One is Hebrew. So the language itself to read the Hebrew Bible in the original, right? There are 24 books in the Hebrew Bible. I think 21 or 22 are in Hebrew. The remaining 2 and parts of others are in Aramaic, but those are minor books, to be frank, and I'm not going to talk about those. So basically, the Hebrew Bible, as far as we're concerned, are the books in Hebrew, and obviously familiarity with Hebrew language, Hebrew grammar is going to be helpful. But again, I'll try to explain things as well as possible. I just want people to realize at the outset there might be some things you don't understand. Okay. In addition to the actual language and grammar of Hebrew, there is also literature outside the Bible that's very relevant to understanding the Bible. So one body of literature is ancient. You can see in the list there, ancient Near Eastern texts to which the Bible can be compared. So biblical literature has a lot of different genres, and the surrounding cultures during the era of the biblical period and before had their own literature. and you might have heard of the Gilgamesh epic or the laws of Hammurabi or Hammurabi's code, right? So those are the kinds of literature that might be useful to help us understand the context in which the Hebrew Bible was written, and even some of the cultural and different words and other things that we might not know, we might be able to learn from the surrounding cultures. Okay, another thing to realize about is there is what's called interbiblical commentaries or criticism. So the second, this is again on the front page of the principles with under literature, the second major bullet point, the second sub bullet point, later biblical texts like the book of Psalms, right? The poetry in the book of Psalms was written much later than the book of Genesis. So there are a couple Psalms, for instance, Psalm 8 and Psalm 104, that seem like they are interpreting Genesis 1. Okay, so that's another source of literature, and it's not dispositive. In other words, just because Psalm 8 interprets Genesis 1 to be saying something in particular, if you ask me, it's that when God says he's going to make man in God's image, it's talking about man's capacity to rule and be sovereign over the earth. Okay, so in a nutshell, that is how Psalm 8 seems to be interpreting Genesis 1, namely God set up as sovereign of the whole universe. The universe as God set up the universe with him as the sovereign, and then humanity was made the sovereign over Earth itself and the animals on it. Okay, now, hey, I'm still getting the hang of this. So the audio skipped a little bit. Sorry about that. But basically, I got lost in the middle of an argument there where I was telling you about what Psalm 8 and Psalm 104 interpret Genesis 1. And what I meant to say there is just because they interpret it that way, or I'm saying that Psalm 8 understands Genesis 1 in this way, does not mean that's what Genesis 1 necessarily means, right? That's a later interpretation that may or may not be correct. I happen to think it is correct, and I thought that before I knew that Psalm 8 also thought that, but that's a side point. Okay, next I'm going to run through more of these. Okay, there's also early extra-biblical and Christian texts, books like Maccabees, then there's pseudepigrapha that are just sort of minor texts that aren't they are in the Christian Old Testament. Some of them are in certain versions of the Old Testament, but aren't in the Hebrew Bible. They're not major things we have to worry about. The Christian New Testament, um, I know very, very little about, so I'm not. And all of the literature in the New Testament came after the Old Testament. So, at least in my view, what I use the Old Testament for to understand its original meaning, probably there isn't too much in the New Testament that we need, but there's certainly valuable material in there that could be useful here and there. There are early historians, the main two known as Philo and Josephus, during the Greek period, Hellenistic period, turn of the Common Era, um, more or less within a century or two. So we have some historical writings there. Then the rabbis for the next 8 centuries did a lot of interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. So we have a lot of their writings. Then the next major advancement, I'd say, is in the medieval times, 11th century or so. A number of extremely learned and scholarly Jewish rabbis, as it happened, wrote their commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, which have been enormously influential and I think pretty good overall. I mean, you have to find the ones that there's no one who I would say always gets everything right, but there are certainly, who the people who seem to have good insights and commentaries are. So you can always check, let's say a certain top 10 list of medieval commentaries. I don't know if this is going to work. Hopefully it will, but I'll just show you that there's one website that recently called Al HaTorah or mgalhatorah.org, which gives you the biblical text with like kind of what I was saying, the top 10, medieval commentaries on it. So if you look up here, this is the biblical text, and then you have these commentaries. In any case, I might refer to these commentaries every so often. You can find them almost all in English. Also, if you're interested, I'm just going to, okay, we'll get to this later because we're still in the principles. So fine. So, and of course there's modern commentaries, right? So going through what the literature that's relevant to understanding biblical literature is. So there are all these commentaries from contemporary times of the Bible, right? And then the rabbis for the next 8 centuries, and then medieval rabbis. And in the last 3 centuries, a lot of people say since Spinoza, so that would be right since the mid 17th century is the period of modern Bible scholarship. And at this point, there are Jewish, Christian, non-sectarian, and other scholars of all backgrounds who have good insight into the Hebrew Bible. Where useful, I will certainly cite everybody that I am aware that whose work I am using. And like I said, the more you know and are familiar with and or have read or want to read these sources, the better informed you'll be. That doesn't mean you have to read these things, but I just want them available for you if you want. Okay, the last thing I'm going to say, I'm not going to get too far into this, okay, but I know I have to make some sort of announcement on this. Is it would help if you have some understanding of formal logic, because I do use terms in I do use logical terms, like for instance proposition, right? Or we'll talk about contrapositives or inverses, and it's going to be helpful. These aren't complicated terms, but I just know that in my personal life, sometimes when I use these terms, they get misunderstood by friends or family or whoever I'm speaking with. So I'll try to point it out as I go, but it would be much more helpful if everyone kind of looks out for things that might be logical terms, or I'm using them in a particularly technical way to refer to arguments or rhetoric. Okay, so those are 3. Like I said, this was all in the first principle, that there may be outside knowledge that's either useful or necessary in certain conditions. So we just went through all of that literature. The second thing I would say, um, sorry, so we said Hebrew as a discipline itself, the language and grammar is important. Then we went through different literature that might be important to understanding the Hebrew Bible. And now the third thing I'm saying is, in my videos, just knowing or sort of following or expecting formal logic terms or symbolic logic terms will be helpful. Okay, good. Now, the next thing, the next principle, I obviously wrote this not obviously, but I wrote this more harshly than I intended. But here's the point, and there's one main point, and then I'll talk about the little consequences. And that is, the purpose of this series is not to provide everybody's opinion about a particular biblical issue. The things that the items and concepts and proposals, theories, hypotheses that I want to share them because I think they are correct. Okay? So I don't care if you heard or I heard, I've probably heard of people who disagree with the points I'm making. Great. You're welcome to tell me. I won't care for the most part. Okay? I am advancing material that I think is correct. Now, what do I mean correct? Because some people will tell you, "Oh, there is no correct. There's only what you think." Okay, that is an opinion. It's not my opinion. Okay, and here I do want to read what I wrote because I want to be precise. I have a definite concept of what I think right? When I say what's the correct meaning, right? What's the correct interpretation in a given verse or chapter or theme of a book or something like that? Here's what do I mean. Here's what I mean. Okay, so I'm going to read again. This is under the second principle. Actually, let's read the second principle and then we'll jump to what I'm talking about. Okay, the primary purpose of the series is to disseminate what I believe are correct readings of the Hebrew Bible for the benefit of 2 main audiences. 1, contemporary and future readers who want to understand, enjoy, or be inspired by the Hebrew Bible. So if you're here to read, understand, enjoy, be inspired, great. You're welcome. I hope it happens. But as I mentioned, the second and maybe even the primary audience is anyone who can utilize my insights to develop further insights into the correct readings or interpretations of the biblical text. Okay, now I'm just going to jump right into that. This principle leads to several consequences. What do I mean by correct reading or correct interpretation? This is a complicated and potentially contentious issue. Okay, we said some people don't think there is such a thing, but skipping to the next bullet point. For our purposes, I utilize the term correct reading or interpretation to refer to a reading, quote, that identifies and or elucidates literary features that A, the author intends as such, meaning the author or authors, whoever you think that is, and I don't care, we're saying the author put these features there, and B, expected readers to recognize as such. And the author, he purposely put in these literary features that I'm saying will be the correct interpretation, and he intended for readers to recognize these literary features as literary features placed there on purpose. Okay, now you'll see the footnote is I borrowed or adapted this definition from a scholar named Mark Biddle, who was talking about what does it mean to have deliberate, right? You have different texts in the Bible. How can you tell if one text deliberately is invoking a separate text? Okay, and whether or not you can tell, he thinks you can. He was saying, I want to identify deliberate instances of this phenomenon. And the way that he described deliberate was by saying that the author put there and that the author wanted the reader to see. Okay. And so he had that definition applying to one very particular well, it's actually a broad intertextuality in general is a broad category, but he was saying let's use this definition of deliberate to talk about references from one part of the Bible to the other, and I'm saying that's the same definition I would use for the literary features that I'm identifying, and we'll talk about ambiguity today, deliberate ambiguity. So I'm saying that it's a correct reading if the author put it there on purpose and intended for at least the enlightened reader to find. Okay, so that's my argument, is that the interpretations that I'm advancing are the original meaning intended by the original author or authors. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go through the rest of this page here, but basically what I'm saying is I don't really care if that contradicts something that somebody learned or thinks or feels emotionally about. That's wonderful. Okay, you can write it, you can comment it. I don't care. Okay, so what I do care about is advancing knowledge of the Hebrew Bible. So if somebody has something that they comment or email or says to me that does advance it, I'll be thrilled, and hopefully I'll address it. Okay, but I'm just saying that likely will not. Well, I shouldn't say whether it's likely or not. Let's see what happens. Okay, now jumping to the second handout or document you can download. These are suggested works that you can use for the video while or before listening to the videos that I make themselves or on your own time. So, okay, so the first one I said was necessary resources. Obviously, it would be very helpful for you to have a Hebrew text in front of you and or an English translation of the Hebrew text in front of you to consult. So I'll just give you a couple. None of this is that important. Go to the online. Okay, so under Roman numeral 1, the third black bullet point, online sources for Hebrew text and translation. So as mentioned, the Hebrew text, that was mentioned above, but every Hebrew text is fine. So in other words, if you find some website you like that has the Hebrew text, unless it's like a satiric website, it should be fine. All the Hebrew texts are standardized. There should be fewer than 15 differences over whatever 30,000 words or whatever. There are very few. There are very few differences in the Hebrew text, as long as it's a real Hebrew text. Okay, fine. Now, in terms of translation, so for English, probably the easiest one to use is Mechon Mamre. You can see it spelled there. Let's see if this will work. Okay, so we were looking at this before, right? And you have in Hebrew English Bible. Okay, so if you want the Genesis, let's say 37, you'd go here, you look under chapter 37, right? And this is a Hebrew English one. But this site also as well, if you don't want the Hebrew, if you don't speak Hebrew, or just want to read the English, you definitely can do that too here somewhere. Okay, find it yourself. The other website that I mentioned for Hebrew, and if you want Hebrew with like the basic rabbinic commentary, right? So Al HaTorah is good for that as well. There are a few other sites that are good, but if you want to buy a Bible, that's fine. Okay, next, I just gave or provided a bunch of literature in different genres that might be interesting. So this is literature from the ancient Near East and surrounding civilizations. So these are all reference works. The first one, don't worry about. But the last three, Daly, Hallow, and Pritchard, those are all English, and they're fully in English. Actually, do they have the... I don't remember if maybe Pritchard has the original languages as well, but okay, fine. But I don't think so. But they're all in English, and if you wanted to see the Gilgamesh epic, or right, the Laws of Hammurabi, or Atrahasis, or the Creation epic, right, you'd be able to find all of that there. Okay, fine. So those are... So sorry, I think I might have... In order, we have resources on the Hebrew text and grammar. Then... Sorry, here's the text and grammar. Then B is literature from the ancient Near East. And then C, these are, I mean, I don't think I've exhausted all the good biblical scholarship. I just had to make some decisions and chose some biblical scholarship that I like and recommend to other people. So you'll find that in part C here, modern biblical scholarship. Hopefully in all those titles, you might find a topic or two that you enjoy. Okay, that is it for the second handout, and that's it for the intro. The next clip will have an actual analysis of a biblical verse. Okay, so let's get going on analysis of a verse. Okay, so we are in Breshit Lamed Zion, or Genesis 37. What you'll see here, hopefully on the screen, is I took pictures of both the Hebrew text by itself on the right and the English text of the same passage on the left, and I used the colors in order to show you which phrases in the Hebrew correspond with which phrases in the English. And as you can see, the blue brackets in both texts show that we're looking at verses 18 through 22. Got a little bit cut off on the Hebrew, but 18 through 22. The green and red are the last pieces of verse 22. Okay, so I'm going to run through the English quickly and get to the end of that passage and then talk about it. So just, and I'll kind of paraphrase also just to get you caught up. So if you know the story of Joseph and his brothers, the brothers hate Joseph. They plot to kill him while he is not with them, and then he arrives, and they decide they're going to kill him. And so, you know what? Let's take it from there. And the only other character you need to know is Reuben, or Reuven. He is the oldest, the firstborn, and he intervenes with the other. There are a total of 12 brothers. There is Joseph and 11 other brothers. Presumably there were 10 of them together here, and not the youngest one. That's a separate issue because that was Joseph's full brother. The other 10 were half brothers. So presumably the full brother wouldn't have, conspired to kill him, or, he wouldn't have kept quiet about it if he knew about it. So, okay. So there are 10 brothers that want to attack Joseph as he approaches, and Reuven intervenes. Here we go. Verse 18 on the left. They saw him from afar. They saw Joseph from afar. Before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come, now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say a savage beast devoured him. We shall see what comes of his dreams." That's sarcasm, right? Because Joseph had a dream that he was going to be in charge of them. So the brothers say, "Hey, let's kill him, throw him into a pit. We'll say that a wild animal ate him, and great." But here we go. Verse 21. When Reuben heard it, he tried to save him. He tried to save Joseph from them, the brothers. He said, "Let us not take his life. Let's not kill Joseph." And Reuben went on, "Shed no blood." He is talking to his other 9 brothers. "Let us not shed blood. Rather cast him into that pit out in the wilderness." So you guys said, let's kill him and throw him into the pit. Reuven says, you know what? Let's not kill him. That's vicious. Let's just throw him into the pit. And he tells the brothers, okay, and he'll die there. That way we won't actually kill him. We won't be murderers. We let him die. Okay, fine. All of these are interesting verses and topics in their own right that bare analysis. Okay, but we're focusing on this last bit here. Okay, so in verse 22, which we cut off in the middle, sorry about that, Reuben went on, shed no blood, cast him into that pit out in the wilderness. So let's not kill him. Let's just throw him into the pit, not kill him first. Okay. Cast him into the pit out in the wilderness. Do not touch him yourselves. Okay, now the narrator then gives us an aside. Why did Reuben do this? In other words, the brothers want to kill Joseph. Reuben says, no, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him into the pit. Why does Reuben want to do this? Okay, so the last bit of the verse says, intending to save him, Joseph, from them, the brothers, and to restore him to his father. So it's not even in context in Hebrew, it seems even more evident. I'll do it with the Hebrew words. Vayomer alehem Reuven, this is verse 22. Reuven said to them, Al tishbechu dam, don't murder the guy, don't spill blood, literally. Hashlichu oto el habor hazeh. Let's throw him into this pit, asher b'lamidbar, in the wilderness. V'yad al tishlechuvo, and don't actively attack him. Place your hand against him, right? Or send your hand against him, literally. Here we go. Now we're on the green verse, the green underlined bit. Laman hatzilo tomi adam. In order to save him from their hands, lahashivo el aviv, to return him to his father. Okay, so I actually dislike the NJPS as the new JPS translation on the left. I don't want to get into it, but I'll translate it myself, again, from the Hebrew. In order to save him from their hands, to return him to his father. Okay, now the question I'm going to ask here probably isn't even asked by anyone because it's just too obvious. The last bit, the red, lahashivo el aviv, to return him to his father. Who's it talking about? Well, it seems like Joseph. But if I had to ask you why, right? In other words, how do we know it's talking about Joseph? Well, you would say, look back at the green. And here's where I'm saying their translation is not literal. Okay, so the green literally translates like this: Lema'an, in order, Hatzil oto, to save him, to save him, Leman, in order, Hatzil, to save, oto, him, miadam, from their hands. Okay, it's singular hand, but they're collective hands. So yeah, either way you want to translate it. Okay, so now you can see why it's perfectly obvious. Leman hatzil oto miadam, in order to save him, Joseph, from their hand, the brothers, to return him to his father, to return Joseph to his father, from whom the brothers want to separate him. Okay, so far so good. Okay, I have less than 2 minutes left, so you guys are in luck. I'm just going to jump right through this. So what's the question here? The question here is, does it have to be Joseph that he is returning to his father? The pronouns don't really specify. It says to return, right, in order to save him, Joseph, from their hand, the brothers. That green part is unequivocal. But what about the red part? Lahashivo el aviv, to return him to his father? So yeah, if there's no other reference, obviously it's Joseph, if nothing else makes sense. But does anything else make sense? So what am I getting at here? And here is where familiarity with biblical literature in general is going to come in handy. What's the relationship between Reuben and his father like? The eldest son, the firstborn, and Jacob? The answer is it's terrible, because in two separate stories, Reuben messed over Jacob, his father. Okay, one was unintentional, but in both cases, it led to bad or negative situations for Jacob, his father. In Genesis 30, 40 through, verses 14 through 16, Reuben finds a gift that he gives to his mother, and then the mother switches with his mother was the hated wife, and she traded the gift to the beloved wife in order to sleep with Jacob. So Jacob wants to sleep with Rachel. Instead, Leah trades with Rachel a night with Jacob, and it's done after Reuben, and not engineers, but triggered the entire episode by giving Leah a gift of these flowers. Second story is much worse. In Genesis 35:22, Reuben sleeps with Jacob's handmaiden, committing adultery with her, and nothing happens there. But we can imagine. Okay, so that's the background to the story. So now when we see lahashivo el aviv, to return him to his father, it very well could be Reuben, because his father hates him. So what I think is going on here is the narrator, by embedding this ambiguous pronouns to return him to his father, is actually sharing that there were two motivations in Reuben's plan. One was to return Joseph, as it says, to save him from their hands. However, when it said to return him to his father, it also means to return Reuben to his father, because his father can't stand him. So once again, Reuben thinks that if he brings Yosef back to his father, that will restore his relationship with Yaakov. Now, you'll see I loaded one paragraph here from an article by, I think the guy's name is Kraut. It's called The Literary Roles of Reuben and Judah in Genesis Narrative. And he refers to this point, and he cites a couple of sources for that same argument, who don't cite that ambiguity in the verse. So basically what I'm saying is, I now think that this ambiguity at the end of Genesis 37:22 actually reinforces this theory that Kraut and his sources here say. So let's look at that first paragraph of this little clip. At the time of the events in Genesis 37, Reuben has twice encroached upon Jacob's marital relationships with Rachel and her handmaiden. So that was the stories we were talking about before in Genesis 30 and Genesis 35, to the detriment of his own relationship with his father. Thus, when the opportunity arises to rescue Joseph and prove that he harbors no animus towards Rachel's branch of the family, namely the beloved wife's branch of the family, Reuben attempts to seize it, that opportunity to prove, right, that he's reliable and loving towards the other wives' children, right, the children of other wives of Jacob, not just his own mother's children. And Kraut there in footnote 40 cites Genesis Rabbah, and then Sarna and Wenem both tentatively suggest maybe that's Reuven's motivation. Now, what I am again now suggesting is that that very motivation was actually embedded in the biblical text by purposely leaving ambiguous the object to return him to his father. It could either be the person we're talking about in the verse, which is Reuben, right? In other words, it's not like he wasn't mentioned. He is the person whose inner thoughts are being reflected in that last clause, to return him to his father, or phrase rather, and it very well could be referring to himself. And that, I think, is open for argument. In other words, why, assuming that this is correct, the author embedded this ambiguity on purpose, why didn't he just say it outright? So that's a bigger question, and I agree with that question. The only thing I would just say to reinforce why I think this theory is true is because this isn't a one-off. In other words, I can show you other cases where there's in my opinion, deliberate ambiguity, either with an unnamed pronoun or the way something was phrased. So this is the purpose of this particular analysis of Genesis 37:22 is to demonstrate the kind of literary depth and sophistication that exists in biblical literature if the reader is paying attention. And unfortunately, in this case, right, reading, I mean, the truth is, in English, you could also come up with the same ambiguity. I guess because it just says to return him to his father. I guess you could argue that. So that's true. Okay, but like I said, sometimes the ambiguity comes from the fact that the Hebrew word is ambiguous, whereas the English translation might not be. In this case, it is, because you're saying him, which doesn't, in English, right, that doesn't give us any more information than the Hebrew word oto, right? Lahashivo, to return him. The o at the end is him, right? Either way, in English or Hebrew, it's still ambiguous. Okay, so this was the first video. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, feel free to stick around. For other videos, I hope to have another one out very soon, but I've learned not to make promises. So when it's out, it's out. Thanks.